All right, welcome in everyone, ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always excited to unpack some fresh insights.
And we've got a really meaty one today. We're taking a piece called EC Leading Others, Mastering Authentic Communication and Influence. And we're going to, well, you guessed it, dive deep.
Sounds intriguing already. Communication and influence, huh? Such essential skills in any context, but especially for leaders.
Absolutely. And this source really hones in on that. It argues that mastering these skills is actually fundamental to what it calls real leadership presence.
Real leadership presence. I like that. It suggests something more than just holding a title, doesn't it?
Exactly, and it gets to the heart of how we connect with others, how we inspire them, how we get our message across in a way that sticks.
I think we've all been there, right? Where you're speaking, but you just get this sense that it's not quite landing.
Oh, 100%. Or you've put your heart and soul into a change initiative and it just doesn't gain traction despite your best efforts,
So frustrating. And this source digs into why that happens, offering some really practical advice to bridge those communication gaps.
which I think is super timely, right? Because especially in today's world, people are really sensitive to how they're being communicated with.
Yeah, absolutely. This piece actually uses the healthcare landscape as an example, pointing to things like staff exhaustion and the huge emotional tax people are carrying these days.
Which makes total sense in that kind of environment. Who your leader is and how they communicate would be even more important.
And what's interesting is the source suggests that teams in this kind of context are craving something specific from their leaders. They're looking for someone who feels real.
Real. Okay.
Yeah.
As opposed to,
Well, I think it contrasts with leaders who might seem polished or scripted, maybe even a bit distant. This idea of real points to a leader whose words and actions align consistently, someone who walks the talk.
right, it's about integrity, but also transparency, right?
Mhm.
Like being honest about what you know and what you don't know.
And crucially, being able to clearly explain the reasoning behind decisions. It's not enough to just say, this is what we're doing. You need to articulate the why.
So it sounds like authenticity is not just some nice to have virtue, but a genuine professional competency, something you can develop and hone.
Precisely. And when you tie that to leadership, it reinforces that being a great leader isn't solely about having the right strategy or even technical expertise.
There's a huge human element at play.
Right. And authentic communication is the key to tapping into that human element, building trust, and ultimately creating a more positive and productive environment.
Okay, I'm really interested in this distinction the source makes between directing and engaging communication. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So the source uses this great example of a leader needing to announce a shift protocol change. A very directing approach might simply be, okay, team, the shift protocol is changing effective Monday.
Short, sweet, to the point. You'd think that'd be effective, right?
You'd think so, but as the source points out, that kind of delivery can actually backfire and create more problems than it solves because it leaves a whole bunch of questions unanswered. And it can trigger immediate resistance. People might be thinking, wait, why is this happening now? Were we even considered in this decision?
And if those questions aren't addressed, you're left with this lingering sense of resentment and confusion.
Exactly. People feel like cogs in a machine rather than valued members of a team.
Okay, so let's contrast that with the more engaging communication style.
All right, so using that same scenario, a more engaging approach might sound something like this. We've been hearing consistent feedback about the challenges with late shift relief, and we know that's impacting workload and even patient safety.
Already you're bringing people in, acknowledging their concerns.
So based on your input, and after reviewing recent patient safety data, we're going to implement an adjusted shift protocol starting next Monday.
You've explained the why, given a clear timeline, and then what's crucial here, what do you do next?
Right, you open the door for feedback. You might say, I really want to hear your thoughts on the specifics of this new protocol by the end of the week so we can make sure we have a smooth transition on the floor.
You're still making the decision, but you're bringing people into the process. You're making them feel heard and respected.
And the source highlights that this engaging approach really boils down to mastering three core elements: clarity, empathy, and decisiveness.
Interesting. So it's not enough to just be empathetic. You also need to be clear and decisive.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot where all three elements work together harmoniously.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. Starting with clarity. What does it really mean to communicate with clarity, especially in this context of leading others?
I think at its heart, clarity is about eliminating any ambiguity or room for misinterpretation.
And the source emphasizes that this is even more important when you're dealing with teams that are already under stress or facing a lot of uncertainty.
Right, because ambiguity breeds anxiety. So clear communication means spelling things out. What are the specific objectives of this decision? What's the rationale behind it? What are the positive outcomes we're aiming for?
And what's so smart, the source also suggests that it could be helpful to explicitly state what's not changing.
Oh, I love that, because that creates a sense of stability, right? Like, even amidst all this change, here are the things you can count on.
And it preempts people from filling in those blanks with assumptions which are often negative or inaccurate.
Exactly. The source actually warns about the dangers of ambiguity because when things aren't clear, people will inevitably try to fill in the gaps themselves, and that can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and
Okay,
problems.
clarity, check. Next up, empathy. Now, sometimes this can be a tricky one, especially in a professional setting.
Right. I think there's this misconception that empathy means being soft or avoiding difficult conversations, but that's not what the source is advocating for at all.
So what is empathy in the context of leadership communication?
Well, the source defines it as having a keen awareness of how your words and actions will be received by others. It's not about trying to please everyone or sugarcoat things.
But it is about putting yourself in their shoes, considering their perspective.
Exactly. And that involves being attuned to the emotional state of your team, understanding how this change might impact their day-to-day work, or even their sense of security.
And being mindful of the timing and the way you deliver your message.
Right, because sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it and when you say it that makes all the difference.
And even when you have to deliver tough news, the source points out that leading with empathy can actually make the message more palatable.
Right, because if you acknowledge the potential difficulties or concerns up front, it shows that you've considered their perspective even if you can't change the decision.
It builds trust, even in challenging moments. Okay, last but not least, decisiveness. And this is interesting because the source is clear that authentic communication isn't about endlessly seeking consensus.
Right, because at some point, a leader has to make a call. And this source argues that team members actually crave decisiveness from their leaders.
What do you mean?
Well, they want to feel like their leader has a clear direction, that decisions are made thoughtfully, and that there's confidence in the path forward.
It's that sense of, we've got this, I trust the person at the helm.
Exactly, because when a leader hesitates or sends mixed messages, it breeds uncertainty and erodes trust.
Makes sense. The source uses a case study to illustrate this point, involving a nurse executive named Lisa. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Lisa is described as being very competent, well-intentioned. She genuinely wanted to address burnout among her staff, and she came up with this new staffing model.
Sounds promising. What went wrong?
Well, her communication approach was very directive. She basically just announced the new model in a meeting, gave a very brief explanation, and then said, "Let me know if you have any questions."
Oh, I can see where this is going. Not exactly the recipe for buy-in and excitement.
Nope. And as you might expect, her staff felt completely blindsided. Rather than feeling supported or relieved, they felt resentful and distant from the decision-making process.
So her good intentions were completely overshadowed by a lack of engagement.
And what's so interesting is that, according to the source, the problem wasn't that Lisa lacked strategic thinking or the desire to help her team.
What was it then?
It was her communication style. It wasn't authentic or engaging. The source argues that even a small shift in her approach could have made a world of difference.
Like what?
Like, if she had proactively sought input from her team before rolling out the change, or if she had spent more time acknowledging their potential concerns, validating those.
And really taking the time to explain the rationale behind the new model, connecting it to their day-to-day experiences.
Exactly. That would have fostered a sense of ownership and collaboration instead of resistance.
All right, so based on all of this, the source offers some really concrete steps we can take to strengthen our own authentic communication. What's the first one?
First and foremost, they suggest taking a good, hard look in the mirror and really examining your own communication style. Think back to a recent major announcement you made, a significant conversation you had,
All right, get specific.
and ask yourself some honest questions. Was my message truly clear and easy to understand? Did I create space for open dialogue and questions? Did I connect with my audience on an emotional level?
Powerful questions. That self-awareness is so crucial. What's the next step the source recommends?
They introduce this concept of transparent framing, which is basically about being super upfront about the why, the what, and the how of your message.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So you start by clearly articulating the reason behind your message or decision, that's the why. Then you state the actual information or action, the what. And then crucially, you invite collaboration by emphasizing the how.
Okay, I like it. You're basically saying, here's what we're trying to achieve, here's why it matters, here's the plan, and here's how we're going to work together to make it happen.
Exactly. And that framing inherently fosters a sense of shared purpose and encourages people to contribute their ideas and energy.
What's the third action step the source highlights?
The third step is about actively practicing listening. And I don't mean just waiting for your turn to speak, but truly hearing what others have to say.
Because communication is a two-way street, not a one-way broadcast.
Absolutely. And that means making a conscious effort to ask open-ended questions, the kind that invite thoughtful responses and encourage people to share their perspective.
All right, the source also includes what they call an action item for our listeners to try out this week. What is that?
This is where we get really practical. The source challenges you to identify one upcoming conversation in your week where your default might be to just give directives or instructions.
Right, we all have those moments where we slip into that boss mode.
And the goal is to consciously reframe that interaction using a more engaging communication approach based on what we've been talking about.
So, not about changing your entire personality overnight, but picking one specific conversation and practicing these principles. What does that look like in practice?
Well, the source suggests starting by taking a moment to pause and connect with the person or team you're communicating with. Even a simple acknowledgement can go a long way.
Hey, I know you're swamped. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Exactly, something like that. Then make sure to clearly explain the why behind your message or request to build understanding and context.
Don't just say, do this, but explain why it's important.
Right. And then instead of just giving instructions, use open-ended questions to encourage dialogue and solicit input.
What are your thoughts on this? How do you think this might impact your workflow?
And then finally, aim to close the conversation by reinforcing a sense of shared ownership, outlining the next steps together.
Okay, so I'm starting to get this. It's about shifting from I'm the boss, do what I say, to we're a team, let's figure this out together.
Exactly. And the source even links this action item to a framework called the 8 Essentials of Communication from a book by Doyle.
Oh, interesting. Which essentials do they highlight?
They specifically mention presence, which is about being fully engaged in the conversation, really paying attention, avoiding distractions.
Putting your phone away, making eye contact.
Right. And then there's curiosity, which is about approaching the conversation with a genuine desire to understand the other person's perspective, asking questions before making assumptions.
And they also mention, but don't dive too deep into, clarity and tone as additional important essentials.
It's a great framework for thinking about communication more broadly.
The source also includes a journal prompt for our listeners to reflect on. What's the focus of that?
This is a great way to personalize the learning. The prompt asks you to reflect on a recent leadership communication moment.
Okay, so think of a specific interaction you had.
And then consider, did you consciously employ clarity, empathy, and decisiveness in your communication? How do you think your message was actually received? And crucially, what's one small tweak you could make in your communication moving forward to foster a more authentic and impactful connection?
It's about that continuous improvement, always striving to be a better communicator and leader.
Right. Because mastering this stuff isn't a one-time achievement, it's an ongoing journey.
Now, before we wrap up, the source gives us a little sneak peek into what else is covered in this leadership framework.
Yeah, so this deep dive into authentic communication and influence is just the first piece of the puzzle.
What comes next?
Well, it looks like the next area of focus is decision-making and agility.
Ooh, I love that. Such a crucial skill set for leaders, especially in today's fast-paced world.
And based on what the source teases, it sounds like they'll be exploring how to make sound and timely decisions even under pressure, how to adapt effectively to changing circumstances, all while maintaining team trust and a clear strategic vision.
Definitely need to schedule another deep dive for that one. All right, so as we wrap up, what's the big takeaway from our exploration of authentic communication and influence today?
I think the core message here is that mastering these skills is not a one-and-done proposition. It's a continuous practice, something you have to be intentional about and work on consistently.
It's like a muscle you have to keep exercising.
Right. And when you prioritize clarity, empathy, and decisiveness in your communication, you build trust, you foster resilience within your team, and ultimately you're able to achieve much greater results.
So for all of our listeners out there, I encourage you to really think about how you can integrate these principles into your daily interactions.
Even small adjustments can have a ripple effect over time.
Absolutely. And I love this question the source poses. How might consistently prioritizing the why behind your communication fundamentally shift your team's level of engagement and your overall effectiveness as a leader over the long term? Something to really ponder.
A great question to leave us with.
This deep dive was inspired by the insights shared in EC Leading Others, Mastering Authentic Communication and Influence, which is part of the Problems and Solutions series within the Executive's Compass framework. You can find more great discussions like this one on the Let's Talk About It podcast series. Thanks for joining us today, everyone.
Thanks for having me.